Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Anacortes Planning Commission meeting for October 27th, 2021. I see, in taking roll call, I see Mr. Cortland absent for today's meeting. Has everybody had a chance to review the minutes, and are there any changes or objections? None being heard, those will be approved. Any correspondence?
Yes, Mr. Chair. I would like to note to the commissioners that we have a regularly scheduled Planning Commission meeting November 24th, and we have two public hearings that evening. It's very close to the holiday, I know, and so we would hope that we will have a quorum for that night. So I need 4 commissioners for that evening. So if y'all wouldn't mind checking your schedules upcoming so that we can confirm, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay. Any new business?
No new business.
We will proceed to the old business, which is a continued public hearing on the floodplain management amendments, the Anacortes Municipal Code, Chapter 1974. Mr. Meismer, I believe we have a presentation.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So previously titled Frequently Flooded Areas under AMC Chapter 1770-020, the proposed draft floodplain management chapter is 1974, and it addresses floodplain management within the city of Anacortes. So the draft 1974 version 1 includes revisions as directed by David Radabaugh, National Flood Insurance Program Coordinator, NFIP, from the Department of Ecology to ensure consistency with FEMA guidelines and the National Flood Insurance Program guidelines. So since we first started working on this, the amendments, the City Council adopted Ordinance 3064 in August related to the updated critical areas regulations, which included the original Title 17 floodplain management under Chapter 1974. So we are currently looking at drafting a version 2 of the draft, which will include all the amendments that you've been looking at currently, but looking at the code sections for consistency between the two. Staff recommends leaving the public hearing open until such time as the draft version 2, which would include any revisions directed by the Planning Commission, has been brought forward to the Planning Commission for review and approval at a future meeting. So one of the things at our last meeting regarding floodplain management was thinking about how sea level rise, climate change may impact the shorelines where our floodplain management areas are on Fatago Island. And at that point, the city contracted with Jim Johannesson, Coastal Geologic Services, to put together a report, which is included in your packet. Mr. Johannesson is here this evening to give a presentation and talk more about that. And with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Jim Johannesson. Go ahead, Jim. You're muted.
Yeah, there we go. I don't use Zoom every day. Thanks very much, Don, and pleasure and an honor to present in front of you folks and discuss this as you see fit afterwards. Just quick way of background, I run Coastal Geologic Services out of Bellingham. I've been doing that for almost 30 years through my company. I've had a couple staff members assist with this. We first did this memo that you've seen in 2017, and then updated a number of sections in the last month here at Don's request. We work on shorelines all around the North Puget Sound and beyond. And we do assessment, mapping, assist with planning, and a whole lot of design work too for erosion mitigation, coastal restoration. And we're seeing more storms than we used to see. We're seeing sea level creeping up. So this is a very timely topic. Our phone's ringing a lot this week with that storm we had on Monday and afterwards. So I want to give you a short presentation. Don and I discussed briefly with going over some of the highlights of the short report we did. And then I've got a few slides at the end on things to consider for policy and for the science side of the policy going forward, and then a couple examples if from other jurisdictions. So let me grab the screen and present here. So I've got this. You can see that title slide, right? Wait, actually, here it is.
Now we can.
You're seeing the title slide. Okay, good. So yeah, looking at the highlights, like I said, this was just updated again last week. Okay, so global mean sea level change. So starting in 1950 here, we've seen only a minor increase since 1900 at the beginning of this graph on the left. And then we go through to 2020, and you've seen these curves before, I'm sure, but we're going to be talking about the likely impacts, and I'm going to be highlighting a little bit, a few of the higher sea level rise scenarios. I think it's wise and cautious to plan for at least the 50% probability that people are talking about these days. I've got another version of this here. This was in meters, so this shows half a meter to a meter being the main envelope for the main scenarios, but a less likely but much higher scenario being closer to 5 to 6 feet, closer to 6 feet on the upper end of that curve. So this is from 2021, the Global Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, some of the reports that are just coming out recently. And then looking at something similar, but catered to the Puget Sound region. Ian Miller with Sea Grant, who we're working on, right now we're working with him on a sound-wide parcel mapping project for sea level rise, and we're developing all the GIS work, which will be coming out in the spring. It'll be more available for all the shoreline parcels around the sound, and they'll all be ranked in terms of risk for flooding, for infrastructure, and for habitat. So that's a product that's underway, but I mentioned that because Ian Miller is the lead author on this study, the Washington Coastal Resilience Network. This is still the most current thing in Washington in 2018, and shows again in feet this time, with the 50% probability, 2100, the end of the century being about 2 feet of sea level rise. But like I said, a lot of people are starting to talk about above these 2018, which are really some 2014 and 2015, 2016 numbers they used, some of their data inputs. Because maybe you heard on the news today, the latest report out of the UN is we're not meeting our goal for the Paris Climate Agreement, and we're falling far short of it currently. Temperatures could easily rise, 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit in this century or more. And ice melt is accelerating. So we're also on the statewide project, we're looking at the 50% probability. We're also looking at the 1% probability as a high number with that in mind. And you see here the 1% goes up to 4.7 feet or so sound wide on an average. So that's extremely serious. I mean, even 2 feet is extremely serious. So that's the range of projections as we understand them now. Looking at the low-lying areas in Anacortes, this is obviously the closer to the downtown portion, subjected to shallow coastal flooding. These figures are out of the report, maybe you've seen them. The wastewater treatment plant is flagged as one thing that's potentially at risk. And these are 3-year average tides between 2007 2009, high tides. And looking at where these low-lying areas are in particular that are potentially subject to coastal flooding. And these data come from Noaa, who has a nice sea level rise viewer that maybe you've seen also. It's referenced in the report. And
Mr. Johansson?
Yes.
On that previous slide, these marked areas are based on assuming how much rise?
Yeah, good question. I realized just now that caption isn't terribly well explained. I believe this is with the 2.9 foot high-end storm surge. I'm just checking back on the numbers on this one. Yeah, that should be better labeled. I agree with you there. Got more exact numbers on this next one, but here, yeah, this is the sea level rise viewer, and I'm sorry, it doesn't even have a specific number, does it? I believe that's, more like 3+ feet. Let me actually show you real quick while I mention it. This data source, I believe, is this one right here. And this is the Noaa sea level rise viewer zoomed into the downtown area. And this has a little slider on it. It's very user-friendly. You can go from, current mean high water, jump to 2 feet, jump to 4 feet of sea level rise. And you start to see these same areas light up with inundation. And up here,
So the one you're showing right now, that small green area is based on a 4-foot assumed sea level rise?
yeah, and I just jumped up to 5 feet. You can see,
Okay.
and this is above mean higher high. So this scenario does not have any storm surge, nor does it have a really high predicted tide.
Yeah,
So-
your document referenced a king tide plus a 2+ foot storm surge.
Right. So this sea level rise viewer, you can, look at all these things quick and easy. This green is enclosed low spot. So that might have water seeping into it, but it's not directly connected. That's what that color is. Blue is directly connected to the water.
Thank you.
So going back to the figures in the report, you can see that is more like the 5-foot scenario above mean higher high. We'll make sure that's labeled more clearly in the report for final. This next version is clearly labeled. So this shows the 2050 50% probability, so right in the middle of the range of projections from the 2018 Washington Coastal Resilience work, and then the 2051%, so the more the extreme projection in the blue and the yellow, which don't show up very far. Just the yellow gets into areas, inside of the marina and beyond. And the 2100 50% is in the orange, with the 2100 1%, coming this entire ring on the edge of town, and the some of the port area up north, and some of Flounder Bay development as well. I don't have the expanded city limits down a little further. From these are still the framework we used in 2017, and then this is updated based on the newer work in 2018, 2019. This also has the 2.9 foot storm surge above mean high water. So let's go back. Mean high water is the average of the highest tide of the day for the whole year. And then we add the 20-year recurrence interval storm surge of 2.9 feet. And then we add the sea level rise projection. So it's pretty close to a worst case scenario.
One more question, since I'm not really familiar with all this so much. When you talk about the 50% and 1%, how would you equate that to a standard deviation?
Not sure I could perfectly equate it to that. I'm not the strongest statistician in the world, but the range of probabilities, the 50% would be, we think this is equally as likely as not likely to be exceeded by the target year. And then the 1% probability says, well, there's only 1% chance out of 100 this is going to happen at the target year. But however, like I said, we're erring on the higher sides because all the projection, all the data is coming in higher than predicted before now.
And the one thing we would have to know more about, I assume, to know about the level of confidence is what assumptions are being used behind these projections.
Certainly, and that's, that's in these very lengthy documents that we're referencing.
To the extent that you can capture that briefly during your presentation, that would be very helpful for me. I'm not sure about the rest of the commission. Am I wasting everybody's time here with this?
Well, they probably don't want to say yes to that. So let me just, I'll just throw in a little bit more detail, make sure I can cover as much as I can, without eating up too much time. The other detail I can tell you about this is based on the slightly higher than average emissions scenario that the IPCC used years ago. They set up these global emissions scenarios, which were highly optimistic. We're going to cut down a lot. We're going to cut down, a moderate amount. We're going to cut down, not too much in global emissions of carbon and methane and so on, or we're not going to cut down at all. And this goes with the one that we're tracking on now, which is we're going to cut down some, but not incredibly large reductions in emissions. RPC 8.5, if you want the details. We are already well above that track right now too for emissions. So we haven't really come that far as a society to counter the problem as a global community. So that, like I said, was the shorelines in this new modeling. And then we have that same exact map, same scenario zoomed in for the downtown core area. And you can see a little closer that, that whole area north of Cap Sante essentially would be flooded, and on around to the east shore of the city with the high scenario 2100 with the storm surge. So, it's pretty much a worst case scenario, we think. I mean, it can get worse, we don't know, but it's using the low probability data. So this is the, the sobering part. I'm not trying to have a block by block mapping, just trying to show you the overview. Some of these areas, it's not really showing up on this map, but there are some enclosed areas that do not contact the water. This is a graphic picked up from the Olympia response plan. They're well ahead of the other cities around here because their problem is worse. Olympia downtown is very low and it's subsiding slightly. So they have flooding that comes up through the street in places today at a really high water. So that's something to plan for everybody. And then here's a few quick snapshots from this other tool by the federal government, by Noaa. This is the Marsh migration land cover data. We're using this in the Soundwide study to look at habitat changes. So the things I might draw your attention to are, beaches, basically unconsolidated shores, like at Ship Harbor, are the light blue color, and down by Weaverling, and all along the shoreline. And then above that, it turns into different uplands and then some marsh units in here, like at Ship Harbor. So this is today at mean high water. And then if I bring in mean high water plus 1.5 feet of sea level rise, you can start to see the marshes move landward, and it kind of jumps to the next level up, so to speak. A freshwater marsh will turn to an estuarine marsh, for example. And you get a little more water in places like Flounder Bay, not too much of a change at 1.5 feet. You start to have water encroaching a little bit more on the shorelines out here. So not super dramatic, but question or? Okay. And if I jump ahead to 5 feet of sea level rise above mean high water, and this again with no storm surge, you start to see a more transition in these marshes, Cannery Marsh, and you start to see the water, creep up higher. These are 30 meter pixels, so it's a little bit coarse, but we start to see changes, and then we have some of the beaches moving up the shores, near above some of these marshes as well. So that's a tool for habitat change, which becomes important for management as well. Moving right along, I'm not going to go more than one slide on tsunamis. There is more in the report on velocity and wave height and all those things. This is another sobering thing, though, with the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake, magnitude 9, which, the big one will probably be somewhere around magnitude 9. And it'll be between, 50 years ago and what is it now? 500 years in the future, somewhere. We're in the window of recurrence of large of earthquakes. So that could send a wave inundation up to 6 feet in Ship Harbor, again, and Flounder Bay, the most exposed to the west. Anacortes Beach gets deep inundation, Alexander Beach, Del Mar in this area. And then we can still get between 6-ish and between 6 and 3 feet and less, much less into the yellow, only 2.5 feet. So you can see it's a significant thing coming in from the straits. So this is highly infrequent, and like I said, a scale of many centuries, but it is still a significant hazard. Okay, so jumping to the latter part of the report, what are some things to think about, and what are some issues that can be regulated and managed? The development standards for flood risk management, this is straight out of the report. The CAO aims to reduce methods of flood losses by controlling the alteration of floodplains, stream channels, natural protective barriers, which might accommodate and deal with floodwaters. By preventing and regulating construction of flood barriers, which will unnaturally divert floodwaters, increase hazards. Currently needs a special floodplain development permit. And then development is defined at the bottom there. I won't read it for you, but these are all the things people do at the shorelines. Of course, the thinking is that a barrier in one place means the water has to go somewhere else. Usually that's more directly a critical thing in a river or changes to lakes and wetlands. Saltwater, of course, is pretty relentless to come no matter how much you stop it in one place, but you can deflect the waves in particular and deflect forces that cause erosion adjacent that cause flooding. So it's those small effects which can have large impacts. So ecosystem and floodplain protection is, there's the physical side, the infrastructure side, which I'm getting to. There's also the ecosystem side. These are two different goals. They've not always been pursued together, is what that quote says at the beginning. Forage fish habitat, I'll show you in just a minute. It's been proven to be a really important part of adult salmon. It's their only diet when they come back in. Forage fish, 2 out of the 3 species spawn on upper beaches. I'll show you that in a sec. That last bullet, these are important habitats that are at risk of being eliminated due to continued construction of hard armor in response to flooding and sea level rise. And there's what's something called the coastal squeeze, which is, if a hard armor or bulkhead is built today, it's effective protecting what's behind it, but the beach gets squeezed out and the habitats get squeezed as sea level rises. So that's one of the serious long-term impacts with sea level rise as well. These are the forage fish spawning habitats in the city area. This is right off Department of Fish and Wildlife website. So surf smelt are the green, along, again, right around the high tide line and just below, scattered around both east and west shore. And then couple little tiny beaches on the north shore. And then sand lance is the orange-red color, which needs a real sandy beach, like over by east side of Skyline. And I think I've just done Crandall Spit in one spot is all I see, Ship Harbor. And then the herring spawn are these big offshore areas which spawn in eelgrass, which is not nearly as directly related. So again, that's upper beach habitats, the first 2. Critical infrastructure, probably top of mind for most folks working in city planning. This is the high sea level rise scenario with the light blue water in 2100, along with the storm surge we talked about earlier. And then, again, it's that same inundation area. And then we have data points from the Washington HAZIS and the geospatial data with the labels being some of the what's termed critical infrastructure. Another thing we're using on the sound-wide study. So pretty self-evident that where some of the problems are, again, much, much better than in Olympia. Keep it in perspective. They've got all kinds of things in flood zones much lower than this. So that's in the report also. Just to wrap up, I've got an example we've learned about recently in King County. Very few jurisdictions have done anything codified on sea level rise. This applies to Vashon and Maury Island only because they didn't want to change what's going on in downtown Seattle, I guess you could say. They're looking at 3 feet above base flood elevation for, considerations for new development starting in 2020 for these islands. These are the more rural parts of King County. And what does that mean? That's, again, I'm not going to read all these, but there's a lot of things that are being regulated on the islands. Again, 3 feet, within 3 feet of base flood elevation from FEMA. You need a professional engineer involved, an elevation certificate, got to have your floors high enough. You're not allowed to fill and build on top of that fill. And then there's some rules about steep slopes and groundwater wells is also. So that's an example. The city of Bellingham is slowly moving towards a 50 inch sea level rise scenario by 2100. So that's 4 feet plus 2 inches, of course. And it's not codified yet in Bellingham, but they are using it as a requirement for the waterfront cleanup sites. So the cleanup site planning that's currently underway had to go back to the drawing board and consider the 4.2 feet of sea level rise, which was higher than they had been previously by almost twice as high. Just a few images to close here. This is from, again, the Olympia sea level rise response. It's a nice graphic of what are the possible solutions to deal with an urban area is what they're doing. They didn't really even consider the term managed realignment or managed retreat, which is basically pulling back from the hazard in the most critical, the most threatened places, because they're talking about downtown Olympia. But that should be in anybody's toolbox. Is at some point, you can't fight sea level rise in low areas without huge investments. But this is, like I said, an urban toolkit here. I'm not going to go into detail. It's just a good reference. Nice simple graphic. And then the bottom of this same graphic is on page 2 here. Basically trying to keep water out on the right and trying to deal with water on the left. And then they've got some nice pictures of those as well. So, if you want to look more info, I'd encourage you to look at this response plan. It's pretty good, multi-chapter document. And then if people really want to think about response plan, that's their flow from that same Olympia document as they worked through the early stages of planning. So that's probably a little above and beyond, and I was going to turn it back over to Don and the commission at this point.
Thank you, Jim. I wanted to add just a couple of quick things. We did get an email out to University of Washington Coastal Management person regarding how many other jurisdictions have taken sea level rise into consideration. And one is Langley. They're 2 foot above base flood elevation. And then Port Townsend as well, 2 foot above base flood elevation. So a couple of jurisdictions that very much resemble Anacortes. So it's something worth thinking about. And I can send a copy of the ordinance that Port Townsend adopted out and around to the commissioners prior to the next meeting, or included in the packet. And with that though, one of the thoughts that I had from a staff perspective is it would be great if the commissioners could discuss this particular topic and give some guidance to staff on where you would like to go with this, whether you would think about 2 foot above base flood elevation as a beginning, and then reassess maybe in 5 years. When it comes to vegetation management, Mr. Johansson mentioned that substantial development or development should include substantial vegetation removal. We actually address that in our shoreline master plan update that will be coming back to the Planning Commission within probably about a month. And in that, we require a report for vegetation removal and a permit through a shoreline exemption or a shoreline permit, one or the other. So we're meeting our habitat requirements through that in the Shorelines Master Program. But again, I'm hoping this evening the commissioners could give me some direction on how you would like us to get some wording in the floodplain management code, or would you like to address that in a different way where we maybe look at it in the Shorelines Master Program? That's entirely up to you. We can do it either way. Or do you want to just leave it 1 foot above base flood elevation for now? I'll be quiet.
Mr. Chair. Jim, thank you for this. Very educational. Can you do me a favor? How does BFE relate to some of the scenarios that you presented? The median higher high water plus the 2.9 plus some of the scenarios. How does current BFE for Anacortes compare to some of those projections?
Yeah, I should have brushed up on that, to be honest with you. But my strong memory is that, I know it's from almost 20 years ago, the mapping in Skagit County and Anacortes. So it has not been updated recently. They are not looking at sea level rise. That's across the board for those FEMA firm maps and related. So they are looking at, as I remember it, basically the high tide and the storm surge, and not going beyond that with extreme, high water plus extreme storm surge, and not going on with sea level rise. So, they're looking at that 1 in 100 year event. It's not really a 100-year event. It doesn't happen every 100 years, and the probability is not an exact science. But that's what they're trying to do, is the 1% chance it happens in a year. So there's no sea level rise consideration in there at all, is the short answer.
So if I understand what you just said, maybe an apples to kind of an apple comparison would be BFE equals maybe the median higher high plus the 2.9. And that's maybe kind of just for comparison sakes. And then anything that we did above BFE, the 1 foot, the 2 foot, the 3 foot, for example, would now take into account possible storm surge or sea level rise?
That's correct. And the big important thing for me when I look at setback determinations and risk and hazards for landslides and erosion is how long are you planning for? So I'm not sure if there's just want to throw that out there. I'm not sure if there's a firm number. The code is trying to adjust as per definition in Anacortes, whether it's 75 years life of the building or 100 years, or if it's not defined. But obviously we're just about 75 years from 2100, and 2 feet is the median projection, the 50% probability. And a lot of people think it's going to go higher. So, that's just a real simple way to look at it.
I've got a couple more questions for you, but I'll let some other folks ask questions before I come back at you.
Sounds like Ms. Ruth.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. That was very helpful. I feel pretty confident that the 2 foot median seems like a pretty, standard. If the city of Langley is using it and Port Townsend is using it also, that feels like that's kind of the bar that's been set. I would be curious to see how they I would be curious to see how they're addressing it. They seem like their cities our size. Port Townsend is kind of a city that's, tourism is its thing, and it's historic as well as we are. So just to answer Don's question, that seems like something that would be a useful example of how they're dealing with it. So that I think that would help me as a commissioner try to think of how we can frame this. And 2 feet does seem like it's what the standard that King County and these other jurisdictions are using. So I would feel comfortable that that's a median. It's not too high in either direction. And it's, like Jim said, maybe higher, probably not lower unless a lot changes. So that seems like a pretty reasonable thing to plan for.
Any other commissioners? If not, Jeff, go ahead.
So I read through your report, and the summary that you provide on page 10 kind of has some things of interest in there. This is highly variable and difficult to predict was one of the quotes that came from this. And then, due to this discrepancy, it is highly recommended. I think there's probably like everything today, there's two schools of thought on this. What I found interesting though, is that if you take into account, maybe this is all based on geography more than it is on whether our town is like Langley or like Port Townsend. I mean, those would be helpful if we're same elevation, same water, concerns with regards to tidal flows. I found it interesting that you mentioned, the earthquake factor, and the fact that the tectonic plate could actually be in some locations rising, which would actually help counter any future sea level rise, right? So, I would agree that there's probably some number that we should come up with, somewhere between 1, which I think is status quo based on what Don said, and higher than that to kind of, bake in some protection for out years. But can you talk specifically a little bit about your summary and some of the conclusions that you made, and the fact that, this is science and it could go either way in the future?
Sure. And just quickly to your point about the tectonics, Anacortes is pretty much on the 0 line for vertical motion, not going down or up. Tacoma and Olympia are going down, Port Angeles is going up. That'll all reverse during the earthquake, of course, but so there's no, and that vertical land motion is it is incorporated in the newer maps I showed you.
Okay.
The red and orange ones. There is a good amount of uncertainty. I think any sea level rise and climate change report you read will say that. So nobody knows for sure what's going to happen. I think I would just, maybe to repeat myself, I'm not sure, but I would say that every projection up till now has been exceeded. And that's in terms of emissions, in terms of sea level rise, in terms of temperature rise. All of those things we're already doing worse than we thought we were going to do in all the earlier modeling. So it's pretty hard to see projections going down as we move forward. And I'm not a global modeler, but I've been reading this stuff for 10 years or more. And you have to think about since we're given uncertainty, and what does the term conservative mean? And with uncertainty, either you say, well, we're not sure, so we're not going to, rock the boat and move things up too high, or take the precautionary principle and you say, well, it could be really bad. Maybe we should, be more cautious. So that's out of my wheelhouse, but that's just, of course, an important consideration.
Thank you. And then Ward, I think, for further discussion, I think the elephant in the room right now is what impact do any of these decisions have on the 2 developments that we know are going to be close to the shoreline, right? We've got the MJB project, which I think kind of precipitated some of this discussion, right? From the talks we were having about the permitting and the concerns, the high water mark and et cetera on that property. And then maybe any future developments over in Flounder Bay, in that area. So, what impact would increasing the BFE +2 have on any of those projects?
Mr. Meismer, do you have any comments?
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So let's, without using the name of the projects, let's use what everybody's been calling that area around 17th Street to 22nd Street, east side of our avenue. And so that area, you may recall some time ago, we came through with the Shorelines Permit. And in that Shorelines Permit, the applicants provided information that that site is actually out of the floodplain. And so basically it's not considered floodplain. So they're not required to meet the 1 foot or 2 foot above base flood elevation because they're well above it with the ground surfaces that they're at, right? Not even prior to their grading, but now with the grading, they're well above flood elevation out there. So
Some of the
yes.
some of the maps that he showed though kind of showed that area being impacted by some of future flooding, and so yeah, and then right there. So obviously, using fill for structural support would be something that we wouldn't necessarily want to write into anything that we did for the east side of our avenue projects. Okay, thank you for
Yeah.
that.
So, and one thing for that project is, I think the maps that Mr. Johansson provided us were those projections with the sea level rise coming in, and in 50 years, yes, that area could very well and would most likely be impacted, and especially by a tsunami. I've got some maps here in my office from FEMA, which were their proposed map changes from a few years back that haven't gone anywhere, unfortunately. And that shows some areas in Skyline that in the future could very well be listed as in the floodplain. So when you take into consideration, if the commissioners wanted to recommend 2 foot above base flood elevation, what does that mean for those homes in Skyline? Their lowest floor level would be 2 foot above that base flood elevation. And then with Skyline having a maximum building height of 14 foot above the highest portion of the lot, it could impact their construction by maybe a foot. But on the other hand, should we be concerned about that height, or should we be concerned about their home flooding in an event 25 years down the road? That's the real question.
Homeowners Association has to deal with the height restriction. I mean, that's imposed in their CC&Rs, correct?
Correct. As far as the city is concerned, they can build up to 35 feet high.
Right, but the CC&Rs there limit to 14 feet from the high spot. But our only concern is that base level. So
Right.
it's for them to figure out or modify their CC&Rs, which probably most people on the hillside aren't going to be real crazy about allowing the people down below to have more height. So, but that's their issue. Our job is to protect to deal with the water damage.
Correct.
I had a question about the BFEs. How often are those revised?
Well, that's a great question. Jim might have a good answer for that. My answer would be the latest that we heard from David Radebaugh with the Department of Ecology on the FEMA mapping that's been in review for years is they're not going to be adopted anytime soon. And that's usually how base flood elevations are revised, is through FEMA flood maps, firm maps. Am I correct, Jim?
Yeah, that's my understanding. I mean, we've seen them at more of a 15 to 20 year cycle, if I can try to average the ones I'm real familiar with. So, we're getting there now, I guess, with the local ones.
And how would that compare to the cycle of concern, I guess you would say, for new construction? When somebody mentioned a 75-year future timeline for projects, how is that looked at within this?
Well, FEMA's always been looking at current conditions based on past data. I know there's rumblings that they're going to modernize their process, but I'm not familiar with the details on that.
I can, excuse me, Mr. Chair. When we look at building codes, we are typically looking at a 50-year life cycle for a building. And, international building code, international residential building code, the design criteria and that, they're trying to look ahead that that building's going to last 50 years.
Okay, so we have a BFE that gets updated periodically, and whatever we decide to do is applied to a 50-year looking forward timeline. I'd say we want to be prudent, and in that regard, I kind of like Ms. Ruther's approach here. I had one last question. What do the insurance companies say about this?
Yeah, so if I might, so the flood insurance rate maps, firm DMAPs, are what the insurance companies use. If you're located in a flood zone, AE or something like that, then they're going to base your insurance rates on that. Mr. Dresky may be able to add to that. And we have, I think we really only have the coastal areas that are listed as flood zones for Anacortes. And that's all the AE zone. And it has a base flood elevation that goes with it. When someone comes in to get a permit, they have to get a flood permit. They have to get a surveyor to shoot the floor in and show that it's a minimum 1 foot above that base flood elevation. And we use the National Vertical Datum 1988 as a reference for that as well, for the mean sea level.
Thank you. Mr. Jaretzky and Ms. Ruther.
Yeah, I noticed, well, go ahead, let her go
Go ahead,
first.
you first, Frank.
Okay. I noticed all the maps really focused on the Anacortes. I take it Guimas permits and all are issued through the county. We don't have any control over that.
That's correct.
Okay, because I would imagine Guimas based on a percentage of shoreline, has a much larger flood issue with a whole lot of homes being built much closer to the water. But again, that would have explained why we weren't really looking at it, or we're not going to be dealing with it. And I also like the idea of that 2 foot. But one thing you did mention, Mr. Meismer, is that whatever we do, maybe we can look at it again in 5 years. That seems to me like a very short period for us to evaluate whether we made a mistake and it should have been larger. And if we think that we'll know that soon, then it seems to me prudent that we maybe think about a little more than 2 feet. If we really realistically think in 5 years, we better check and make sure that was adequate.
What would be the typical cycle for reviewing the Shorelines Act in its entirety in any case?
The Shoreline Master Program updates occur just about every 5 years. That cycle's an average, I think. And we can certainly either push that out, or my thought of having a 5-year review was, okay, well, has any of the science changed? Do we know something 5 years from now that we didn't know in 2021?
That sounds good to, that sounds like a cautious way to do it. My add-on was, since I lived in La Serena, Chile, and it's very earthquake prone. When I was there, I felt they build with, what is it called? The really, really solid structures. What is it? The wire, but anyway, they build for a tsunami. If a tsunami comes, it's either the first or second floors are meant to just kind of be destroyed. And so if, they get warning if it's a tsunami and everyone goes higher. And so they build in preparation for if there is a tsunami. Their building codes support that. And, and if you go right on the shoreline, our favorite coffee place is right on the shoreline. They're built to be destructible. They're built for that 5-year timeline. I mean, they're kind of little shacks. So, I mean, there are ways that your building code can kind of accommodate to that, so that, structures that may be taken out in that time frame it's a given. And they did, when, one of my friends there, they did have a tsunami and everyone went higher and it took out the first floor of a lot of places. but not many lives lost because they didn't plan for it.
Are there any other questions or comments from commissioners? Perhaps we should go to the phones and see if there are any public comments.
Mr. Chair, there are no public in attendance.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, it's Gary.
Mr. Moore.
Yeah, just mine is just a couple of process questions that occur inside the document. One, I like the idea of the 2 foot. That makes eminent sense in the 5-year review period. But inside the document, some of the phraseology I think needs to be clarified. There's phrases like compatibility of proposed uses, etc. But definitions are missing. And so what is the guidance to be provided if we're going to manage this document? How do we manage it? What are the definitions that are approached? And I'm looking at page 13 for that issue. Page 22, one of my favorites was the critical facilities. And again, what is a critical facility? How is it measured? And if it is a critical facility, how does it fit inside the building code? That's it.
Okay, I'll make sure and look at the definitions and that we have something in there as a definition for a critical facility. We actually do have a definition looking at it.
Really? Oh, I missed it. I
on
thought I
page
read
7.
thoroughly. I'm sorry?
On page 7.
Oh, okay. I'll go back and take a look. Thank you, Mr. Mesmer.
Yep. And then critical facilities are also addressed in the International Building Code and require special attention for earthquake and flooding as well.
I knew it was referenced somewhere, but I did not see a reference back. So thank you.
Yep, absolutely. So if I might, Mr. Chair, just to elaborate a little, it sounds like the commissioners are agreeing that a 2 foot above base flood elevation would be a good way to go.
Perhaps we can poll. Does anybody have any objection to that?
I don't think we should go any more than 2 feet. It would be interesting to see if there's any more discussion to be had to see whether or not we just stick with the status quo is 1 foot right now.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Well, as I mentioned before, I'm willing to go with the 2 feet. I think it's prudent to consider the combination of factors that have been presented without overreacting in the short term before we have a better idea of what's happening in the long term.
Very well. Well, commissioners, I will put together a draft version 2 that would include a recommendation from the Planning Commission for a 2 foot above base flood elevation. And I will review the document for consistency and bring that back at an upcoming meeting. Unfortunately, I'm going to be out of town on the 10th, so I'll probably see if we can get this on the 24th, along with a couple of hearings that we'll have.
Sounds good.
Given that the documents are usually posted ahead of time, I assume we may have some public commentary at the next meeting when we get down to brass tacks. So I propose that we continue this hearing and continue the opportunity for the public to comment after we have some more definitive documents for them to look at.
Absolutely.
I've got one question before you close. Other than the referenced Langley to Port Townsend response plans where they actually increased and went to a 2 foot BFE, is there anything out there that would at least provide us with some information as to whether or not a 1 foot BFE for Anacortes would still make sense? Is there something that's happening today that requires us to increase this by 12 inches? And if if it is, what is it? Where can we study and learn about it? And what would be the impact other than the, the one project area that we talked about, which doesn't have any impact on that specific project? Where can we learn about this before the next meeting?
Jim, would you have an answer to that?
Well, I mean, do you mean from the comparative planning standpoint or from the science of sea level rise standpoint?
Yeah, I think from the science of sea level rise.
No, I
No?
think more from the planning, because I think your document does a pretty good job of explaining the sea level rise portion of this. I think on a, what impact does this have on the public? What impact does this have on future development? From the planning aspect, I'd just like to know a little bit more before we decided to increase this by 12 inches.
Okay. Well, thank you. What I'll do is get in touch with a couple of local property owners, including the one east of our avenue, and have a conversation with them about what impacts they feel this might have on various projects. With raising it 2 foot above. We've not had any issues with the 1 foot above base flood elevation. We get maybe 3 or 4 houses in the floodplain a year, and those all meet the requirements for the 1 foot above base flood elevation. And I have not heard of any issues with those.
Yeah, and if I may, the 1 foot above the BFE, that's been fairly standard for a very long time in, I believe, federal and, a lot of local jurisdictions. So that's pretty much been the status quo without considering sea level rise.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any last comments before we close? So we will continue this hearing until the next time this comes onto our agenda. In the meantime, thank you everybody for your work. Mr. Johansson, that was a very complete report. Appreciate it. Good night, all.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Jim.
Thank you.